Good. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for the invite. I am the conference court jester. As you may know, the fate of court jesters is somewhat iffy. My job is really to say the unsayable, and that's the job of the court jester. Of course, the fate of the court jester often ends up in, if the king doesn't like it, you end up in trouble. So I've done this job before, by the way. This will be not the first conference that I've been kicked out of. A few years ago, Accounting Organisations and Society commissioned me to write a paper on their 21 years to celebrate their critical research. So I reviewed 21 years of awful stuff and came to the conclusion that there was absolutely nothing critical there at all. And so I wrote a paper called The Twilight of Criticism, and I got discontinued from the conference. So this may be my second event. This, by the way, is a pseudonym. My name is not really Tony Tinker. I am Ludwig Fehrenbach. I'm not dead though yet. However, the title is something I want to stick with because this is going to be an argument that is addressed predominantly for students, because I regard practitioners as too obsessed with doing useful work and therefore not too interested in intellectual pursuits. But sometimes you turn up and surprise us. Give us some unpleasant surprises at times. Nevertheless, students who want to be troublemakers, this is for you. Property is theft is an argument that you can make in various ways. The obvious one is that from a very commercial point of view, too often property, by establishing patent and copyright, freezes innovation. It impairs the process of development, and corporations frequently invest most of their energies in ensuring maximizing their cash flow, which means keeping the competition to a minimum. And also, of course, restricting access, which may mean, for example, important drugs don't get to everybody. So there are problems with the issues of copywriting, even from a purely commercial point of view. But that's, of course, I'm not interested in that. I want to be more inclined towards the more socially destructive point of view of copyrights. The problem with copyrights, Jensen and Meckling, who are darlings of the right, they invented one of the awful journals, Journal of Accounting and Economic Research, as a detour from JAR, because they weren't getting all their publications out there. They wrote a nice paper in 1980 which basically volunteered this view that property rights are not really something that are established by man, but rather they have a quasi-religious origin. That is, that they're something that is eternal and immutable and certainly unproblematic. I'm going to take the contrary point of view, that property rights are established by struggles over the imposition of, I'm being provocative here because I don't have much time, the imposition of a process. They're not something that are just mechanical, they're not a bookkeeping exercise, not just a legal issue, but they are more than that, and the history of the establishment of property rights is a good illustration of this point. Those of us who teach know only too well that textbooks that now cost $200, you could deliver the same material for a couple of cents. The publishers for many years stalled on that technology until they could ring-fence the publication process and ensure that they could milk the student as heavy as they can. This is not an issue of just mechanics, it's an issue of politics. New York State is doing their best right now, and they're not the only state, to force publishers to unbundle their package to ensure that students start getting value for money, and the real costs start to be reflected in the prices that are being paid. Copyrights are not just an issue of mechanics and technology. I want to go back to the history, because the history of property rights are important. During the 18th century, my great-great-grandfather used to work in Manchester, which was called the Smoke. You may understand why they called it the Smoke. China has the same problems today. Manchester, the first industrialised city, had the same problems. It was the Smoke. They only got one day a week off, Sunday, thanks to the Church of England. They would have worked them for 7 days a week if they could, but the church said you've got to have 1 day of rest. They would take off from the Smoke and go out to the countryside. These were the moors, or the Peak District in particular, connections between the lands between Sheffield and Manchester, and walk. It's called fell walking now, but it used to be called walking then. You just walk from one place to the other and you'd get the fresh air and you'd enjoy yourself. But it wasn't an unproblematic move. They had to cross estates run by landowners who had bailiffs with bludgeons that ensured that walkers had a painful journey. Those rites of passage were ancient rites of passage that you were, if you refreshed the walk once every 50 years, then that walk became a public domain again. But it was not something established, and so these groups of workers would go out and struggle to get and establish the right of passage, the right of way, and to struggle against those property rights that the landowners were insisting on. This is, of course, not an unfamiliar tale. I publish 2 journals, Journal of Accounting and Economics and Journal of Accounting, Journal of Economics and Accounting. International Journal of Economics and Accounting and whatever. 2 journals, you can look them up somewhere. Abe Briloff writes, some of you may know him as an iconoclast in the accounting field. He's done great stuff recently about Google, focusing not just, by the way, on their tax evasion practices. Did you know Google pays less than 5% in terms of its corporate taxation in the US? Why? Because Google is an Irish company. It's not an American company for tax purposes. So, Briloff again. And Briloff's other warning, of course, is what is Google doing to our universe of knowledge and access? This is access to books that eventually that they will be able to control access to, which means that our population, our citizenry, their ability to educate themselves will be curtailed by the ability to pay. Now, here we go. This is about where I should probably start thinking about asking whether my engine is running outside. But I want to make this argument forcefully about what property rights and the establishment of property rights are. And the one great example was led in the US by Abraham Lincoln on the Homestead Act, where he gave away massive quantities of American land to settlers who could fire a rifle and create a dust ball. This was a way of establishing property. It was, by the way, the same problem existed in the UK when we were talking about establishing the commons. Some of you may know in England you've still got places called the commons. They are places where there was no ability to establish ownership, and so those lands became common access. There are places in London that are as big as Hyde Park, the Streatham Common, which is what I grew up in, and there's a whole range of other commons. They are public land because no ownership was established, no property rights were established, so they became part of the public domain. But, going back to Abe, the confiscation of Indian lands, of course, was not an act that was achieved with mechanical and easy movement. It was a system of ethnic cleansing And there were a lot of people who died as a result of that. And by the way, I'm English, and therefore my hands are dirty as well in this. It wasn't just an American experience. We did great things as well. And the authority for this, of course, if you go back to some of the early writers, that of manifest destiny. This is also an authorization to take over property as we wish. And the authority for that, 1845, John L. Sullivan. Our manifest destiny is to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Property is today. Theft is resolved by lobbying, money, and force. That's how we establish property rights. They're not just a technical issue of writing contracts or making bookkeeping entries. There is a nice research issue for troublemaking students and colleagues, because you have to decide on these issues which side you're on. To this day, there are struggles over property. And I just don't mean landed property, other parts or kinds of property, intellectual property, internet property, access to that kind of material. These are all issues that are not technical only, they're social and conflictual. Done.